Hey everyone, tonight we're going to talk about a door. Not a physical one, but the kind that opens with a single, seemingly innocent click. It's a story about hope and a second chance, the kind of hope that blossoms in the quiet, lonely hours of the night when the only light in the room is the glow of a screen. You see a face, a smile, a bio that seems to speak directly to you, and you think maybe this is it. But what you can't see are the shadows lurking just outside the frame, the carefully constructed falsehoods, the darkness that waits patiently behind the pixels. It's a terrifying reminder that the most devastating threats to our lives often arrive disguised as our greatest desires. The truth is, when you invite a stranger into your heart, you might not survive the encounter. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Invite viewers to post their location and local time. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Her name was Gerlinda, and for 4 years silence had been her most constant companion. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, a shroud that had settled over her life the day her husband died. The house, once filled with the comfortable noise of partnership, was now an echo chamber for her solitude. She was a successful entrepreneur, a woman who had built a thriving business from the ground up, a woman who could command a boardroom and negotiate complex deals without flinching. But here, within her own walls, she was adrift. The memories were everywhere. His favorite armchair still holding the faint indentation of his form, his reading glasses on the nightstand, the scent of his cologne still clinging to a jacket in the back of the closet. The grief was a dull, persistent ache, but it was the loneliness that was beginning to gnaw at her, carving out a hollow space that her success and her memories couldn't fill. She yearned for warmth, for closeness, for the simple comfort of another person's presence. Doubt and hope were at war within her. Was it too soon? Was she betraying his memory by even considering the idea of loving again? Her heart screamed for connection, but her mind was a minefield of fear. She'd had a good marriage, a true partnership. The thought of starting over, of being vulnerable with someone new, was terrifying. The risk of another disappointment, another loss, felt immense. But the alternative, a future of these silent, heavy evenings stretching out into infinity, was somehow even more daunting. It's a peculiar human trait, isn't it, this inability to accurately predict how we'll feel in the future. Psychologists have a term for it, affective forecasting, which is a fancy way of saying we're all pretty bad at guessing what will actually make us happy. Gerlinda was forecasting a future of either potential heartbreak or guaranteed loneliness, and she was beginning to feel that the potential for joy was worth the risk. One evening, as she was scrolling aimlessly through the news, an advertisement caught her eye. It wasn't one of the flashy, youth-oriented dating apps with their promises of fleeting fun. This one was different. It was for a dating portal aimed at people like her. People who had lived a little, loved a little, lost a little, and were looking to try again. The faces in the ad weren't 20-somethings with perfect bodies. They were older, with laugh lines and hints of silver in their hair. The tagline was simple. Life wants to be lived. Dare again. She stared at it for a long time, the cursor hovering over the link. Her internal monologue was a chaotic mess. This is ridiculous. You're not this person. What would people think? But another voice, quieter and more insistent, whispered, why not? What did she really have to lose? A few hours of her time? A little bit of her pride? It seemed like a small price to pay for a sliver of hope. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She took a chance. She poured a glass of wine, sat down at her computer, and clicked the link. Creating the profile was an exercise in awkwardness. How do you summarize a life in 500 characters? Successful but lonely widow seeks non-psychopath for conversation and maybe dinner. Must love dogs and tolerate a house decorated in what can only be described as late 90s comfort. She chuckled to herself, deleting the joke. This wasn't the place for her brand of gentle sarcasm. She settled on something more dignified, more honest, and uploaded a recent photo where she thought she looked happy. Then she began to browse. It was a strange and surreal experience, like window shopping for a soul. She scrolled past men who seemed too slick, too sad, too much like they were trying to recapture a youth that was long gone. She was about to give up, to close the laptop and retreat back into the safety of her silence, when she saw him. His name was Emeka. His profile picture was warm and engaging, with a smile that reached his eyes. He wasn't classically handsome in a movie star way, but there was an intensity and a kindness in his gaze that drew her in. His bio was brief but intriguing. He was from Nigeria, living in Austria on a temporary residence permit, and passionate about art and music. It was just a profile, just pixels on a screen. But as Gerlinda looked at his picture, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't just hope. It was a spark of genuine curiosity. There's an old piece of anachronistic wisdom, often misattributed to a variety of ancient philosophers, that says, "Fate leads the willing and drags along the reluctant." Gerlinda had been reluctant for 4 long years, and now, suddenly, she felt willing. She knew nothing about this man, nothing about his life or his character. For all she knew, he could be anyone. And yet something compelled her, a single, seemingly harmless click. That's all it took to like his profile. It was a tiny, insignificant action in the grand scheme of the universe. But in that moment, a door opened, and Gerlinda, full of a fragile, newfound hope, had no idea that she had just stepped across a threshold into a nightmare from which she would never truly escape. That single click was like dropping a stone into a silent pond. The ripples spread instantly. A notification appeared less than an hour later. Emeka had messaged her. The initial exchanges were exactly what the original script described, harmless, almost mundane. They talked about the weather, their days, the best places for coffee in Vienna. But the pace and intensity shifted with an unnerving speed. Emeka was a master of the form. His words were a carefully woven tapestry of compliments and promises, each one designed to snag on the frayed edges of her lonely heart. He wasn't just charming, he was a student of her needs. He would ask a question, and before she finished her answer, he seemed to already know the sentiment behind it. He celebrated her success, mourned her loss, and painted a future so vivid she could almost taste it. It was a masterclass in manipulation, so subtle that Gerlinda never felt the net closing around her. She felt seen. She felt cherished. She was experiencing a textbook case of love bombing, but she didn't have the language for it. All she knew was that this man, this stranger from the internet, was filling a void that had been aching for years. There's a quirky little tidbit about Vienna's Artists International Kino where they decided to have their first date. It's one of the few cinemas in the city that prides itself on showing films in their original, undubbed language. Emeka suggested it, saying he wanted her to experience the film as the director intended. To Gerlinda, this wasn't just a date suggestion. It was a sign of his depth, his intellect. It was all part of the act. That evening, under the warm summer sky, he was even more captivating in person. They saw some forgettable indie drama, but the movie didn't matter. It was the after that sealed her fate. Over drinks at a small cafe, he held her hand and looked at her with that same intense, kind gaze from his profile picture. He talked about his dreams, his struggles as a foreigner in a new country, and his belief that fate had brought them together. For Gerlinda, it was intoxicating. It felt like a second chance at life was not just knocking at her door, but kicking it down with a bouquet of roses. The hope that had been a fragile flicker was now a bonfire. After 4 months of this whirlwind, she felt it was time to tell her parents. Marianne and Joseph were in their 80s, products of a different Austria. Their childhoods were colored by the aftermath of the Second World War, a time of scarcity, uncertainty, and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. Their worldview was forged in the fires of Reconstruction. Security, family, and tradition were the pillars of their existence. They loved Gerlinda fiercely, and their love was expressed through a thick armor of caution. From their perspective, a relationship with a much younger man from Nigeria, whose residency was temporary, wasn't a romance. It was a 5-alarm fire. You could almost hear their brains screaming scam alert in a way only octogenarians who still don't fully trust automatic doors can. The conversation was as tense as she'd feared. She found herself on the defensive, her voice tight with frustration. "He's a good man," she insisted. You don't know him." They didn't understand. For them, his precarious legal status was a giant red flag. For her, it was a source of empathy, a challenge they could overcome together. This is where her own mind started to betray her. She was exhibiting a powerful confirmation bias, actively seeking out information that supported her belief in Emeka while dismissing her parents' warnings as generational prejudice. Their valid concerns about his motives were filtered through her narrative of a grand, unconventional love story. Every warning they issued only pushed her further into his arms. It's an old piece of wisdom from the French philosopher Blaise Pascal: the heart has its reasons, which reason knows nothing of. Gerlinda's heart was screaming, and it was completely drowning out the quiet, desperate logic of her parents. The relationship intensified. Emeka became her entire world. The invisible wall between her and her daughter, Anna, grew thicker. Gerlinda found herself censoring her conversations, afraid of Anna's judgment, afraid of having her perfect bubble burst. Her friend Elizabeth tried to break through, but Gerlinda kept her at a distance, ashamed of how completely she was surrendering herself, yet unwilling to stop. Then came Valentine's Day. Emeka made her dinner in her own apartment. He lit candles. He put on soft music. It was the stuff of romantic comedies. He told her she had saved him, that she was his anchor, his reason for everything. And then he got down on one knee. He presented a ring, not extravagant but beautiful, and he asked her to be his wife. In that moment, all the doubts, all the warnings from her parents, all the tiny, niggling worries she had pushed to the back of her mind, they all vanished. All she could see was this man, offering her a future she had thought was lost to her forever. She said yes, her voice thick with tears of joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and as he did, a strange, involuntary sensation prickled her skin. The script mentions an iciger shower, an icy shiver that crawled up her spine. His hands trembled slightly, and for a split second, the smile on his lips seemed off. Too perfect, too practiced. It was there and gone in an instant, a fleeting moment of cognitive dissonance that she immediately dismissed. It was just nerves, she told herself. Her nerves, his nerves, the sheer overwhelming emotion of the moment. But the web was now fully woven, the promise was made, the deal was sealed, and Gerlinda, blinded by a love she so desperately wanted to be real, couldn't see that she wasn't his beloved fiancée. She was his next major acquisition. After the proposal, Gerlinda lived in a dream state for a few weeks. She bought bridal magazines, something she found both thrilling and faintly ridiculous. At her age, she imagined a small, elegant ceremony in Vienna, surrounded by the few people who truly mattered. Her parents, her daughter Anna, her friend Elizabeth. It would be a quiet affirmation of her new beginning. But Emeka had other plans. His desires, it turned out, were far more pragmatic than romantic. He approached her one evening with a look of deep concern etched on his handsome face. He explained, in that calm, reasonable tone of his, that getting married in Austria would be a bureaucratic nightmare. The paperwork for a Nigerian citizen to marry an Austrian was, he claimed, a mountain of red tape designed to take months, if not years. "They will try to stop us, my love," he said, taking her hands. "They don't want to see us happy." His solution was France. It was brilliant, he insisted, romantic, spontaneous, and, most importantly, fast. He'd done his research. There's a little-known quirk in the bureaucracy of the European Union, a loophole big enough to drive a truck through if you know where to look. Marrying in another Schengen country, like France, could expedite the visa process for the non-EU spouse of an EU citizen, bypassing much of the national-level scrutiny. "We can be husband and wife in weeks," he whispered, his voice a seductive mix of logic and passion. "We can start our life together, without all this waiting, all this suspicion." To Gerlinda, who was already battling her parents' skepticism, the idea of avoiding a long, drawn-out governmental inquiry was deeply appealing. After a brief hesitation, the desire to finally secure their future, to prove everyone wrong, won out. She agreed. The wedding was nothing like she had dreamed. It took place in a drab, impersonal municipal building in a small French town she'd never heard of. There were no flowers, no music, just the drone of a bored official reciting legal statutes. Gerlinda wore a simple cream-colored dress she'd bought for the occasion, but she felt foolish, like a child playing dress-up. Her family wasn't there. Her friends weren't there. The only witnesses were two men Emeka introduced as his cousins, though they shared no resemblance and barely spoke a word to her. They looked less like wedding guests and more like guys who had been offered 50 euros and a free lunch to show up for an hour. Gerlinda paid for everything: the plane tickets, the hotel, the marriage license fees, the depressingly bland meal afterward. It was a significant sum, but she told herself it was an investment in their happiness. The change in Emeka was immediate and chilling. The second the ceremony was over, the warmth in his eyes seemed to extinguish. As the officials stamped their papers, his smile became what the script so perfectly described: practiced, mechanical, and utterly devoid of joy. His gaze was empty, as if he was already looking past her, his mind on the next phase of his plan. On the flight back to Vienna, she tried to hold his hand, but he pulled away gently, claiming he was tired. That evening, she tried to talk to him about it. "Is everything all right, my love? You seem distant." This was the beginning of the gaslighting. He looked at her with feigned surprise. "Distant? My love, I'm happier than I've ever been. You're just exhausted from the trip. You're being too sensitive." He was so convincing that she began to doubt her own perception. Maybe she was just being emotional. Maybe the stress of the secret wedding was making her paranoid. He was an expert at turning her reality on its head, making her feel like the source of the problem. Back in Vienna, the meeting with her parents was excruciating. They greeted their new son-in-law with a strained, silent formality. Their concern was a palpable entity in the room, thick and heavy like the air before a thunderstorm. They didn't say a word against him, but their eyes, full of a deep, sorrowful worry, said everything. Gerlinde found herself chattering away, overcompensating, trying to fill the dead air with tales of their romantic French elopement, her voice sounding brittle and false even to her own ears. That night, alone in her own home with her new husband, the feeling of isolation was more profound than it had ever been when she was truly alone. She had married him to cure her loneliness, but she had never felt so disconnected. There's a principle in the ancient code of Hammurabi, a sense of grim reciprocity, an eye for an eye. It was the foundation of law, the idea of a balanced contract. Gerlinde had just signed the most unbalanced contract of her life. She had given this man her heart, her trust, and a substantial amount of her money. He had, in return, given her his name and a legal claim to her life. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sound of his breathing beside her, she clung to the hope that this was just a difficult adjustment period. But the charming man she had fallen in love with was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating stranger. The invisible shackles of their marriage were beginning to chafe, and she had the terrifying feeling that she was now a prisoner in her own home. Life with the man who was now legally her husband quickly devolved into a grim routine. The first order of business, once Emeka had his precious Schengen visa-stamped passport in hand, was for him to find work, or rather, it was for Gerlinde to find him work. She called in favors, leveraged business contacts she'd spent decades cultivating, and set up a series of promising interviews for him. Emeka treated these opportunities with a stunning level of disdain. He'd either not show up at all or attend and deliberately sabotage the meeting, only to come home, shrug his shoulders, and say, "The work was not for me." It became clear he was allergic to the concept of a 9-to-5 job, or really any job that didn't involve spending her money. The financial bleed accelerated. Gerlinde was still running her business, still the sole provider, yet by the end of every month, the money was gone. When she finally confronted him, demanding to know where it was all going, he didn't even have the decency to lie. He admitted, with a casual indifference that chilled her to the bone, that he'd been spending his days in the local wet bureaus, the betting shops. For those unfamiliar, these places are a unique ecosystem. They are cash-heavy, often dimly lit, and filled with a desperate, nervous energy. They are phenomenally effective at nurturing addiction, offering the instant gratification of a bet on anything from German football to virtual dog racing. Emeka would take the household money she gave him for groceries and lose it all before lunch, then come home and act as if nothing had happened. His cruelty then took on a new dimension. He decided to invite family over. A cousin from England, he announced, was in a bit of a financial jam and needed a place to stay. Gerlinde, still clinging to the tattered remnants of her role as a supportive wife, agreed. She bought a new bed, set up the guest room, and even helped the woman look for work, all from her own pocket. But the cousin wasn't a victim, she was a co-conspirator. Her presence was a weight, another pair of eyes watching Gerlinde, making her feel like a stranger in her own home. The woman's stay ended abruptly when, as Gerlinde would later learn, she had to flee the city to avoid prosecution for a series of petty scams. Her sudden departure was less of a family emergency and more of a get out of town before the police connect the dots situation. With the buffer of the cousin gone, Emeka's behavior grew more menacing. The mask didn't just slip, he ripped it off and threw it in the fire. The moment of truth came during a fight about money. He had lost their rent money again. When Gerlinda's voice rose with desperation and anger, he stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. He unbuckled his belt, pulling the leather strip free from his jeans. He didn't hit her, he didn't have to, he just held it, letting it hang from his hand, and hissed, "You will hold your tongue, you will not question me." In that moment, Gerlinda felt something inside her snap. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs, and locked herself in the bathroom. She slid down the door, wrapping her arms around her knees, trying to make herself smaller. This is a state psychologists call learned helplessness. After months of gaslighting and manipulation, her spirit was so eroded that her instinct wasn't to fight or flee the house, but simply to find a smaller cage within the larger one. The Roman philosopher Seneca wrote extensively about the things we can and cannot control. She couldn't control the monster on the other side of the door, but she could control the door. It was a small, pathetic piece of sovereignty, but it was all she had left. She stayed in that bathroom for hours, long after he had left the apartment. The silence that followed was more terrifying than his rage. When she finally emerged, she knew it was over. A few days later, her voice shaking but firm, she told him she needed space. She told him to pack his things and leave. To her shock, he didn't argue. He didn't plead. He reacted with that same cold indifference, as if she were a landlord ending a lease. He packed a bag, walked out the door without a backward glance, and was gone. For a single fleeting day, Gerlinda felt a profound sense of relief. She thought she had survived. She thought she was free, but the nightmare was just entering a new phase. He wasn't trying to win her back, he was trying to break her. The anonymous calls began, always in the dead of night. Sometimes it was just silence, the sound of breathing. Other times a distorted voice would whisper threats. Then came the physical attacks on her property. One morning she came out to find one of her car's tires slashed. A week later a long, deep scratch ran the length of the driver's side door, a jagged scar carved into the paint. She called the police, filed reports, but without proof there was nothing they could do. It was her word against the empty air. He was a ghost, a shadow tormenting her from just out of sight, and she knew with a certainty that settled like ice in her stomach that this was not the end. He was just getting started. The harassment was a form of psychological warfare, but Gerlinda tried to fight back with the only weapons she had, lawyers and the legal system. On her attorney's advice, she filed for divorce, hoping to legally sever the cancerous growth that was Emeka from her life. But the system she trusted to protect her became his new playground. Emeka, it turned out, was a savant of delay tactics. He'd ignore summonses, claim to be sick on court dates, and switch lawyers to force postponements. He knew the law better than she did. Not the spirit of it, but the cynical mechanics. He knew that if he could just drag the proceedings out past the 3-year anniversary of their wedding, his residency status in Austria would become permanent. The law, in its majestic, blind impartiality, was helping him win. During one of their few forced encounters in a courthouse hallway, the last vestige of his charm evaporated, replaced by a reptilian coldness. He leaned in close, his voice a low hiss, and made a promise that froze the blood in her veins. "You think you can get rid of me? I will destroy everything you love. Everything." It wasn't a threat made in anger. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the calm certainty of a man mapping out a business plan. The phone call came on a Tuesday, deep in the suffocating stillness of the night. The ringtone, once harmless, now made her heart seize with panic every time she heard it. But this wasn't an anonymous number. It was the police. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and utterly devastating. There had been an incident at her parents' address. She needed to come. The words were sterile, but their meaning was a tidal wave that swept the foundation of her world away. Marianne and Joseph were dead. The police later told her there were no signs of a forced entry. The killer hadn't broken a window or kicked down a door. He had been let in. And in her heart, Gerlinda knew. Her parents, in their final moments, had likely opened the door to their son-in-law, the man they had feared from the very beginning. The murder weapon, found at the scene, was a heavy-duty wrench from their own tool shed. The image of it, the sheer domestic brutality of it, would haunt her waking moments and her dreams. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. Her desire for love, her refusal to see the truth, had led this monster to their door. Emeka had vanished. An international manhunt was launched immediately. It's quite a process, actually. When a fugitive is suspected of crossing borders within the EU, a European arrest warrant is issued, and agencies like Europol help coordinate the search. It turns a continent into a dragnet. For weeks there was nothing. Emeka was a ghost in the system. Then, an anonymous tip came from Brussels. It's funny, in a grim sort of way. For all his manipulative genius, Emeka likely couldn't resist pulling a small-time scam on the wrong person in Belgium, and that person decided to make a phone call. There's rarely honor among thieves. He was apprehended, living under a false name with forged papers. The trial was a surreal spectacle of civility applied to an act of pure savagery. The evidence was mountainous and damning. CCTV footage placed him near his in-laws' home, his forensic traces were at the scene, and his web of lies unraveled under the prosecution's questioning. Emeka himself sat through the entire proceeding with a placid, unnerving calm. He showed no remorse, no sadness, no anger. His expression was blank. It was a terrifyingly clear portrait of what the public loosely calls psychopathy. He simply didn't possess the hardware for empathy or guilt. His only concern, it seemed, was the loss of his own freedom. When the guilty verdict was read, lifelong incarceration, the highest possible sentence, a ripple of relief went through the courtroom. But for Gerlinda, there was no victory, no catharsis. The ancient Greeks wrote tragedies about the nature of justice, like the Oresteia, where even a righteous verdict brings more blood and more ghosts. The court had delivered its justice, but Gerlinda would be haunted by the furies of her own memory for the rest of her life. The judge read the sentence, a litany of legal phrases and statutes, but no amount of formal language could ever capture the horror of what had happened or fill the void where her parents used to be. In the aftermath, she began the slow, painful process of dismantling her life to rebuild it. She sold the family business that held so many memories, both good and bad. She legally changed her name, shedding the identity that was tied to so much pain. And she moved to a different city, a quiet place where she could be near her daughter, Anna, the last remaining anchor in her life. The trauma and the grief are still there, of course. They are her constant companions. But they are not her jailers. Every day is a conscious choice to take one more step out of the long, dark shadow cast by the man she once dared to love. And so, our journey into the shadows comes to a quiet close. Gerlinde's story is a harrowing reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a welcoming smile, a testament to how a simple human search for connection can sometimes lead us down the most terrifying of paths. It is a chronicle of manipulation so subtle and so complete that it dismantled a life piece by piece, leaving behind a wake of unimaginable sorrow. But it is also, in its own fractured and resilient way, a story of survival. It is a narrative that does not truly end with the sound of a gavel in a silent courtroom, but one that continues on in every small act of courage Gerlinde performs each and every day. The sharp edges of such a profound trauma may never fully disappear, but with the slow and gentle passage of time, they can be worn smooth, softened by the simple, quiet persistence of a life that has chosen to continue. It reminds us that the greatest tragedies do not always have the final word, and that the immense strength required to simply face another morning is a silent, unheralded victory in itself. Her story is a solemn caution, a warning whispered into the void of the night, but within it, there is also the faintest echo of hope. It is the hope that comes not from forgetting the darkness, but from learning how to carry the immense weight of what has happened without letting it extinguish the small but steady flame of the self. Love is meant to be a sanctuary, not a cage, and our vulnerability should be a bridge to another, not a weapon to be used against us. Let her story be a quiet reminder to always trust that instinct, that small, still voice within. And now, as the story fades and the silence returns to your room, may it be a comfort, a safe harbor. Rest easy and be well.